Welcome to the third and last session of today's Interact Global, the free virtual edition of Nomensa's Interact conference. Hello if you're just joining us, or welcome back if you've been watching today's sessions. We've already had two very interesting sessions today with Henny Swan from Tetralogical and a panel discussion about commercial impact of accessibility chaired by our own Alistair Campbell. Before we start, please do get involved and say hello to each other in the chat. Make sure you have switched our chat settings to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. And do let us know if there are any audio issues or any issues with the stream, and we'll try to get things fixed as soon as possible. However, we are also using auto-generated captions for this session. Some of these may not be 100% accurate. However, when we share the talks publicly on our YouTube channel, we will ensure that the transcripts are accurate. Now, we're really excited for our last talk of today's Interact Global. This talk is about how designers forget to consider accessibility, from design director at Verizon, Brandy Bora. In this talk, Brandy will educate designers and the accessibility community on typical ways accessibility is forgotten in the design process and talk you through tactical and design-focused solutions. Please do ask a lot of questions using the Q&A box. I will ask these to Brandy at the end, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So without further any ado, I will hand over to Brandy to begin. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Brandy. This talk is how designers forget to consider accessibility. It's a pretty lengthy talk, so I'll try to go through it as quickly as I can so that we have a lot of time for Q&A, because the Q&A for this talk is usually pretty engaging. So let me just go into it. Let me see if I can present. Yeah, I have to click through. Okay, so here's my basic outline. Who am I? What's my point? The design process, the engage phase, the discovery phase, design phase, delivery phase, implementation, and then opportunities for addressing issues throughout those phases. And then a little summary over everything that we just discussed. There are alt text in this presentation. If you're able to access this, this is through a Google slide. If you want the presentation later, I can share it with you, or the organizers can share it with you as well. So, hi, I'm Brandy. I'm a creative director at Verizon. Verizon is a big American teleco. I have about 20 years experience designing lots of different kinds of things: signage, applications, physical objects, websites, games, immersive experiences, processes. We have about 33 million users of all different abilities. We're a telecommunications company. We provide internet, cable, and cellular service. We also have, in addition to our 33 million users, we also have hundreds of designers, thousands of developers, dozens of vendors, and 170,000+ employees that work on our platforms. I also want to shout out to our awesome accessibility teams. We are very, very fortunate in that we have a few accessibility teams that work with us very, very closely. And it's very fortunate that we have them as a resource, and they helped create a lot of this content with me. There's an image of me with a mask over my face, because that's usually how most people see me these days. The only time anybody gets to see my face really is through a web seminar or a video call like this. Just some examples of some projects I've worked on. I've worked on that touch accessibility. I've worked on a series of physical remotes with Comcast, an American cable provider. I currently work on the My Verizon app, which is the app that services Verizon customers. I've worked on the American Express Serve product. I've made some games like this Connect hack. And I also worked on this project that was codenamed Beacon at the time, that's become a piece of street furniture produced by a couple different companies in the US, and then also like informs and designs that you might see sprinkled throughout the EU. I actually don't know if you can see it, if the little presenter tool masks it or not. Let me move this thing around. Yeah. Right. So I just want to disclaim a little bit that the opinions that I'm going to express today are my own opinions. I'm speaking on a personal capacity, using my own experiences as a design director. Most of my examples that I'll share as visuals are coming from projects I'm currently working on, but I'm also going to talk through things that are illustrative, and I'll also walk through conversations I've had that were illustrative of experiences in the past from a variety of experiences in my personal work history, not necessarily Verizon, which is my current employer. This was originally created in Google Slides. I can export it to different platforms if anybody in the conversation needs it. I will also describe the images as we go out through the talk. So sorry about all that. What's my point? My point is designers forget about accessibility. In the background here, I'm showing a very long scrolling image of an example that I like to use from the Recess product. Recess is a CBD beverage. That this is its website. They had a huge marketing push here in the US and especially in Brooklyn. They use this vaporwave look and feel. They have a design that intentionally breaks the grid as the user scrolls. The visual design gets more and more chaotic and a little bit in terms of grid layout, looser, more open, less consistency between hierarchy and elements on purpose to convey a sense of relaxation, like euphoria and all of these pleasant things that people want to associate with CBD or cannabinoid products. But for users with cognitive disabilities or visual impairments or anybody using assisted technologies, this view can't be engaged with at all. What's the read order? Most of the text here is actually an image. There's a lot of, you can't see it here, but there's a lot of motion and parallax events that can make that sort of visual sensibility lost for somebody who's low vision or not sighted. So in my experience as a creative director, accessibility is usually an afterthought in the design process. It's often discussed as something that's way too much work, something that's too expensive, or becoming accessible or producing accessible design is not aligned with trends. These are two examples that I've used a lot in the past, less recently, because now these are older examples. But in the early launch of the Acorns app and then the early Domino's pizza tracker, I had a lot of clients for a lot of different projects that would cite them as oh, we want our version of the Acorns app, or we want our version of the pizza tracker. So I was asked over and over again by lots of different clients to create their version of something like that. But those things that they were referencing weren't accessible. The example on the left is a very early version of the Acorns app, which is an individual share investment application. And it had a lot of data visualizations in it to project various earnings against your investment portfolio. And for someone who's very financially literate, they might be able to understand this information and decide and prioritize which information is of value to them. And to those that are new to it, I think the impact they were trying to make at the time was impressive. They wanted this amount of data and information and these projections to ensure that that users felt confident about the projection of their earnings and that they felt intelligent, sophisticated, and the negativism I'm going to use to describe this work is chart junk. So that can often mean a lot of times in data visualizations that you add a lot of information that may not necessarily be truly helpful in the view because it gives the impact of data, it gives the impact of intelligence or of progress or these sort of forward thinking kind of big ideas. We used to call stuff like this minority reporting, where it feels very future and it feels super intelligent because there's a lot of information. So you want to pack the view with information that may not actually be necessary to the content or to the user because the emotion that you're trying to evoke justifies it. So if you look at Acorns today, it's not nearly this complex in any single view. And if you are a financial professional, you probably have your own tools that you like to use to produce your own calculations, your own projections, your own pivot tables, or whatever you're trying to solve. But this is a very early version, and I'd have to do a lot of talking people out of designs like this. And then the early Domino's pizza tracker is the image on the right, and it was an example of a very big class action lawsuit here in the US, where the early designs of this pizza tracker were inaccessible, and therefore people using assistive technologies couldn't couldn't use this tool at all and could not order pizza. Domino's fought it and doubled down on it a couple times, saying that it was too expensive for them to rebuild their entire pizza tracker platform for blind users. And the ADA and the lawsuit basically said that, like, when you provide a service and you provide a method of engaging with your product, you have to make sure that ADA compliance that was originally written for physical spaces does indeed like spill over into digital spaces. And we can use the WCAGS guidance for how to ensure that you're doing what you can to make your digital experiences accessible. So, you know, and when this came out, same thing, a lot of clients give me the pizza tracker, and we'd have to make sure that if we did any of our own recommendations on tracking and monitoring, or like multi-step processes, that those multi-step processes were accessible even when we knew the Domino's pizza tracker at the time was not. So, you know, another reason why designers forget about accessibility, especially when they're engaged in a sort of per contract or per project basis, is timelines. Project timelines are packed with activities that already overcommit designers. There is a culture, especially in agency setting, of overcommitting design. Maybe COVID's alleviated some of that. I wrote this pre-COVID. I'm also not currently in an agency anymore. So maybe the culture here has shifted, but it's my experience working in agency and working with agency that the schedules, these are screenshots of some of my schedules, are really, really intense. The amount of hours that are crammed into a project are already well above regular working day. And in that competition for space and time, accessibility is often laid out. You can see, like on the left, I have an image of swim lanes for a project plan. We've got a strategy swim lane, an IA swim lane, a research swim lane, and a visual swim lane. There's not an accessibility swim lane in this project at all. There are also no milestones necessarily related to accessibility. And then I'm just showing an image of a calendar. So this is a team calendar, not an individual calendar. And you can see like how many events there are in a week for a typical designer. This is an image I'm sharing that just illustrates a design process. You know, it's represented linearly with circles, just meant to convey that it's iterative. It's not necessarily linear. It's not necessarily waterfall. It could be waterfall, it could be agile, it could be whatever shape that your process takes. But this is what I'm going to use just to talk about the design process at a high level. So accessibility is often relegated to the end of the entire phase of work, whether you're iterating or not. It's at the very, very end. It's a check almost, just like any other control against a project or any other regulatory body against a project or design. The phases I'm going to talk about today are the engage phase, where the goal is to frame the problem and engage teams. I'm calling it engage because this is very focused on anybody that's responsible for kicking up a project. The activities that this produces are requests for proposals, statement of work, or any other materials that start a program or identify the need for a program. Discover is when designers are engaged already and they learn more about that problem space. They might stakeholder, secondary research, competitive analysis. There's a lot of activities. These are just some of the ones I'm going to highlight. Design is the phase where we describe the experience. I gave that a very loose definition because we could be talking about anything. I'm going to talk about software experiences that have a heavy visual design component, but you can think about this as applying to any other type of design: physical, experiential, virtual. So activities might include a trend map, concept design, user testing, or final design. And then in the delivery phase, I'm going to focus on delivery to a developer, but you could project your own delivery. That could be delivery to a client, to an architect, to a build, whatever that means to you in your project. Some of those activities are documentation, user stories, grooming. User stories and grooming are very specific software activities, but again, like you think about, I'm going to use those as an example, but think about what that might mean for you and the things you create. And then at the very end, I have implement, and that's where someone will build your experience. I'm going to talk about developers, but that could be anything. Activities are development, user assurance testing, visual quality assurance testing, and accessibility testing. This is, if at all, where accessibility typically shows up in a traditional design and software development process. All right, so in the engage phase, the purpose of these next few pages are to talk about problem areas that exist today, and then we're going to switch and talk about opportunity areas. But in the engage phase, RFPs, requests for proposals, and SOWs, statements of work, usually focus on the business need, the timeline, and the artifact. What do we, the client, need? When do we need it? What do I need from you? They sometimes will highlight specific elements of the visual design, but that's about it. So here's some examples of language that comes in those SOWs. Spend 10 weeks creating at least 15 to 20 key screens for app and web, work with business partners to understand the business requirements, reflect our brand style guide while staying ahead of trends, understand the needs of a new market segment, produce 1 to 3 hero flows and innovative concepts that appeal to them. Words like innovative, push trends, contemporary, fresh, those kinds of words often creep into SOWs and are given as guidance to the agency or the design team that's contracted to work on it, so that they understand that they need to look at like a specific subset of humans or design something for them. This language by itself is not necessarily problematic, but it can be limiting. It's at the very early phase of work, and it does begin to narrow where the designer should be looking. And later on, when we talk about opportunities, there are opportunities in this space to make sure that accessibility stays important and top of mind very, very early. In the discovery phase, so this is once the design team is engaged, they're usually asked or guided to focus on a very specific segment of a market or a persona. And that segment or that persona might limit inclusivity. Sometimes the company already has a set of persona that they use or very identified segments that they know a lot about. Sometimes they don't, and they have a general bias toward a particular segment. But it's my experience personally that the persona and the stakeholder often resemble each other, especially when we're talking about like financial space. Personas are generalized and typically abled. Research usually focuses on the experience of a typically abled user. So if you're given a body of research, those are usually with a bias toward typically abled users or customers. And then competitive analysis doesn't consider accessibility. So any benchmarking or any trend mapping or any competitive analyses that are done as part of your project or that have been done by the company and given to you have no idea whether or not the platforms or the services in that comparison are accessible for anyone. So you can take those things, they're still usable tools, but you just have to be mindful of the fact that those experience, while interesting or even profitable, may not be accessible at all. They may not be in compliance. They may not even be usable. So I have 2 images here of just illustrating the persona Steve Smith and the persona, or and the stakeholder John Jones. Both are like affluent seeming middle-aged white males wearing similar clothing, just to visualize like my personal experience of the similarity. So then in the design phase, oftentimes what happens is that designers getting caught up in the relationship with their stakeholder and with their company and with the brief that they're given, they accidentally or purposefully sell the stakeholders an inaccessible design. So what will happen in this process is designers, especially very visually oriented designers, will collage trends, will pull references, they'll work with their stakeholders, they'll work with typically abled end users, they'll produce a set of images that excite the stakeholder to get buy-in and eventually like a go-ahead. I'm sorry, there's a image, like a broken image there that's flashing a lot. If that's an issue for you, I'll progress ahead. But there's a row of GIFs here. These are pulling different images from Dribbble. This is something I used to see a lot. I'm seeing less of this in the world these days. But first step would sort of be a collage of Dribbble experiences or Behance experiences. And these are usually made by students or they're made by people on the weekends or on their off time. And they're meant to communicate some kind of like proof of concept or show off an attribute like use of motion or use of color or layout or something interesting. But as a software designer who's a more technically focused, like none of these are real pieces of software to me. And I find it over-reliance on images like this misleading. But not everybody that's not part of the stakeholder group understands necessarily like all the details of interaction design or software design. And they might see things like this and just be straight dazzled by them. Oh, these are amazing looking. I love like how fresh and new this seems. And they say yes to this, and that makes it progress into the next rounds of the design process. Another challenge is that testing platforms have limitations, especially low fidelity and medium fidelity testing platforms. So a design team might come up with a design and validate it, again, with typically abled users, and might collect feedback on usability from those typically abled users, but accessibility and the needs of people using assistive technologies or having other methods of interacting with a piece of software don't have the opportunity to give early input. The examples I'm showing here are two examples that we have at the company I currently work for. We use Envision and Figma to test prototypes, and then we use web-based testing tools to test remotely or to validate remotely. We can talk through some of the issues, and we do what we can to make sure our screeners include users of different abilities who identify as low-sighted or identify as color challenged, and who identify with like dexterity issues and other kinds of things. And we might show them an image or describe an image to them and collect feedback on it. But we're in a fortunate position that we at least do that and can be mindful of that. And we have a partner accessibility that we can talk through and hypothesize with. That's not the same thing as really robust, like early validation, which is what we would love to get to. And then in delivery, once the concept is sold, accessibility and other groups are often positioned in opposition to the design. So that means someone already said yes to that design and they said move forward with that design. That means any opinion that's a modification of that design is in opposition or is asking for a change in something that was already approved. The design team might be finished with their work or with their engagement at this moment. That makes accessibility feedback out of scope for the design team, or it might be a change order or a handover to a different team. That leaves the whole process up with this like binary option. They can either shoehorn that concept, that original concept, into accessibility, or they have to degrade that design, at least in the like mindset of a lot of teams. The image I'm showing here is a GIF from The Simpsons where Homer is giving Mr. Burns some feedback. He takes that feedback and puts it into a paper shredder and throws it out the window. As that's basically like my experience of what a typical relationship is like once accessibility is engaged. And then at the very end in the implementation phase, this is a worst case scenario, but it happens all the time. This might be the first time accessibility sees a design for the first time, or somebody who's even like a mindful or aware of accessibility as a need. This could be a developer who's just looking for how to tag and provide alt text to a simple layout. They might see a design and think to themselves like, oh my God, like, how am I going to do this? How can I even like make this work? And all the bad failings begin. So my GIF here is of an adorable student receiving an F on his paper and making a sad face. So in that worst case scenario, that might be where accessibility sees a design for the first place, and they might be furious or very, very frustrated and having very, very strong feelings about it. Sometimes those feelings or that feedback gets sent back to the design team in these kinds of ways. That's not accessible, that won't pass, accessibility won't like that, accessibility rejected your design, contrast fail, make contrast 7:1, that's too small, I can't make that accessible, that blue is too blue. These phrases, while probably accurate, especially in specific instances, don't necessarily communicate a solution to a designer or even how to begin to solution for a designer. It just says something's wrong, but not necessarily like what or how or why. Especially because strange when a designer often doesn't hear these things at all. And again, they might be completely gone from the engagement. Their engagement might be over and they might have moved on to something else. So how do we flip all that into an opportunity? How can we include accessibility throughout the process to become more mindful of the needs of all users? So I'll give you some tactics in those specific journeys. There are probably much more, I'm sure there are much more. But these are just some that I've used that we find helpful. Again, like our system is not perfect. We still have things that we are working on every single day. But these are big strides that we've made that I'd like to share. And hopefully there'll be some value for some of you here. So in the engage phase, create language for all teams to use in SOWs, RFPs, and project kickoffs. In discovery, have accessibility become a stakeholder. Educate your designers and create ways to test concepts. And if your organization doesn't have an accessibility team, somebody who's accessibility mindful can insert themselves or identify themselves as a stakeholder and can review work with accessibility in mind as early on as possible. In the design phase, you can create a playbook of examples that help educate the designers on how to draw accessible experiences in your framework or for your user. And then in delivery, you can have accessibility evaluate and provide feedback as part of the delivery process. Just as you would show something to a developer to understand the level of effort, you should show that same thing to your accessibility team to understand how it impacts them and how it impacts users with different abilities. And then in the implementation phase, we can turn any of those like worst case scenarios or complete failure moments into teachable moments. And that's a time to establish yourself as a partner and prevent future occurrences and to insert yourself in these like earlier phases of the design process. So examples I'm going to use, in 2017, we did a major rebrand of the My Verizon app, and it took a ton of work to make this design accessible because this design was never considerate of accessibility. At best we had some alt tags and some tagging of major components. So like titles of pages would be read to a screen reader, maybe buttons sometimes, and button labels kind of. But not only that, like visually, we had a heavy reliance on imagery, text as image. Our colors were pastel, our type was very small. We had a long list of issues that made this design not usable for a lot of people. So right now we're in the middle of designing a new visual design system and interaction design system, and we're partnering with our accessibility team to ensure that we want the design to look clean and fresh and all those like words, but we also want it to be usable. We want all of our 33 million plus users to be able to use our systems and to have like a pleasant time using them, not having to parse through and interpret like very complex system. So this is something we're in the middle of developing together. The public version is available on through like these two formats. This image isn't available yet, but it will be like sometime next year. And we want to do these things. We want to have color contrast that we know are low contrast and very like visually oriented. But if you are not visually oriented, it doesn't break your experience to not be able to engage with elements like these low contrast containers. One thing that we do is we created language that we can leverage during engagement. Again, these are also like publicly available, but they're also part of every single SOW or contractual commitment we have with any team. So we defined what we meant by accessible in this way. Experiences work for customers with low and limited vision. We design text, buttons, and navigational elements to the color contrast ratio of 4 or 5 to 1. We use visual indicators with interactive elements. Experiences have to work for customers without vision. We design experiences so that screen readers can properly move through our screens and flows. Numbered list is laid out so that screen reader moves through it correctly. Experiences work for customers with limited mobility. We design inclusive experiences that allow customers with limited motor function to tap and scroll simply and easily. We don't create experiences that rely on sophisticated gestures. Like this is language that I wrote, like that last sentence with the accessibility team to make it very clear for a designer. You can't have an experience that relies on force touch and force touch only. That won't be accessible to most of our user base. Just because somebody saw something cool on Snapchat and that works really well in Snapchat doesn't mean it's something that we can use to pay a bill for a utility company. Experiences for customers must work with cognitive language and auditory challenges. So we keep our layouts very simple and having a very, very clear left to right, top to bottom hierarchy. Our language is very easy to understand. We avoid idioms and other things like colloquialisms. And we only include visuals when it's necessary. So we're not a very illustrative heavy brand or application. So for us, like we just literally spell out, don't use imagery to rely on your message. That works for us. Other brands are very different and they use imagery a lot. But for us, this is a guidance. You can't have your experience hinder on an image. Become a stakeholder during discovery. So at Verizon, accessibility is a stakeholder that helps us understand our needs. In your organization, this might mean you need to establish a center of excellence, even if that center of excellence is like you devoting an hour a week or something. Draft a charter, socialize that charter, explain what it is and how it matters very specifically for your problem space, for your users in a way that is very, very, very personal to your experience. That's the only way that people will understand like how any of this like matters to the things you make. Offer yourself as a resource, offer yourself as somebody who can help do this a lot. Building a team of friends within the organization takes a long time, and it will only be successful if you are the person who takes up the burden of help and responsibility. My little GIF here is an image of DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air from a childhood favorite television show doing their secret handshake. That's the kind of relationship that you have to build with people in your organization to get them to be able to intuit accessibility and why it matters. Create helpful examples. So the WCAG is a great resource for people that are willing and able to understand what this is and how to use it. But if you just share a link to your design team or to your developer team or your stakeholders, they're not going to read it. It presents as something for specialists. It looks very like library sciences, and that intimidates most people away from it. Or because it's set up sort of as a set of rules, that might also set up the mindset, well, I can't see anything that literally matches my rules, or there's nothing here that specifically states that I've broken a rule. And that might get you into a like rule breaking following sort of pattern. And we kind of want to get beyond that. It's about intuiting the considerations, not like, did we break rule A, B, and C? Like, yes, that, but also much more than that. And then this is what I mean by helpful designs. You literally have to draw examples that show what to do. And I don't have one here, but like what not to do. Draw a very plausible what not to do. Often the what not to do's are so silly, like no one would ever do that anyway. But you want to draw like a very nice looking, well-considered, but incorrect version of it. That really helps designers understand like why something is correct and something is not correct, or something is like less correct, less usable. I've just got two examples here. I'm not going to read through them. The one on the left is the hierarchy rule using a complicated layout, and the one on the right is a form element, and just some tips we have on working with our form elements. These are based on the WCAG guidance, but they're written specifically for our elements and components. And then in delivery, we work with research teams. You talk through all your challenges to validation and come up with a plan to capture validation and feedback as early as you can. Think about what are your limitations? What considerations do you need to include in your test? How could you simulate things like a screen reader? How could you simulate a gesture-based demand based on what you're creating, or a physical component? Consider having participants that would identify as having those kinds of challenges or challenges that were impacted. Just have them for like a chat for discussion. Like even if you can't give them anything to interact with, just to talk through the scenario and collect feedback. Little GIF here of a printer printing out test, 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 test. Testing is very important. Feedback is very important. And then in delivery, you can use this opportunity to provide feedback on the design. So if you've inserted yourself into the process and you see that design might be problematic, you can help the team make their design even better, even more usable, even more accessible. Using the meme here from Wonder Woman, your design is good, but it can be better. Leave comments on the design. Try to avoid pass fail. Try to avoid solutioning language. I know this is very, very difficult. How can you just say more than like, that's wrong, but without being like, do this instead? Try to use things like a value add. So if you say this text feels too small, try to increase the text or legibility. There's lots of different ways to increase readability other than size. If you are not a typographer and you don't have the literacy or the vocabulary to describe typography, try to find a way to talk about like the issue. There's something with the type feels too small. The type is hard to read. Just try to couch it in your own experience. The type is hard to read. The type might be hard to read. There are things that are absolute, like color contrast. This does not meet contrast rules. Try to increase the contrast if you can. And then if you have a relationship with a team, you can add a level of effort. This design seems really complicated and seems like it's going to take a high level of effort to make this work for a lot of our users. And then in implementation, this is the time where you can coach, you can reject, you can partner, or you can power through. This is very specific to every single team. Whatever tactic you choose is based on your own experience and your relationship with your team. I can't tell you what tactic will work best with your team. My current environment, coaching and partnering is the best way to get things done, but I've certainly worked in other teams where a rejection model, a reject and resubmit was also like the fastest way to get things done. So just think about that, like creating some kind of, it might be good for you to create a formal boundary where you accept and review work and then provide comments and then take one of these tactics. I'm just showing a GIF from Futurama, fix it, fix it, fix it, fix it. This is the opportunity for everyone to understand what specifically needs to be considered for users using assistive technologies, especially, but any major usability concern with a design. And then repeat. So empathy should be an attribute of the user experience design. So if you identify yourself and you partner and with a designer and educate them, you should build new advocates out of that relationship, so that future designs become more usable and the whole process of this is less painful for everyone and more collaborative. So like in summary, designers forget they've got a lot of stuff going on just as everybody does to complete a project. Trends are often very inconsiderate. And I mean that literally, not necessarily like in a mean way, just, you know, trend is thinking about something else. They're not thinking about necessarily the usability of their drawing. The process is not inclusive. The process often forgets to be inclusive in lots of different ways. We're talking about just accessibility today. But you, as the professional, you can educate your teams, you can partner with them, and you can create new advocates out of this kind of experience. Here are some references. This is the Verizon accessibility team. You can reach out to them like on LinkedIn, or I mean, you can email them and see what happens. I'm sure they'll probably be into it. This is a Verizon Media Group accessibility team, aka Yahoo. So these are the people that we partner with a lot. Guidance, you can read imagery that was used here. Yeah, that's me talking about stuff.
Thanks for that, Brandy. Really useful, insightful presentation. If anyone has questions for Brandy, please submit them now in the Q&A box. I really loved how you described this tactical approach. I'm sure like everybody can take those recommendations and start implementing tomorrow. I was wondering at Verizon, how long did it take till you get to this point where you are today, you know, that you really integrate accessibility in the design process? Has it been years, months? What was the journey? And what were the biggest obstacles you had throughout?
Well, I think so. We had one, when I first joined 5 years ago, we had a major project to stand up a new mobile first, mobile only like experience that did not make it. So I have to talk about it in a vague way because it did not launch. So it's like in a thought drawer somewhere. But since it was going to be mobile only, like it has to be accessible. So luckily somebody identified that as a requirement before I joined, that it has to be accessible. So they engaged the 1 or 2 accessibility professionals to be on the like early committee. Just like we're utility, so we're also lucky in that every regulator is involved in utility, like everybody. And my background is financial services, so I'm really used to partnering with regulatory groups like very early on, because there's no point in like wasting everybody's time designing an experience that isn't compliant for a lot of different reasons. So that's part of my personal like experience that I brought to this. So I also like have a background in accessibility, like accidentally. But yeah, getting that heard was very hard. So we had a design already, like that was already bought and paid for. That was like not accessible at all. Like at all. Like it was a color space that was like very cool, but like very low contrast. Just everything about the type scale was very fine, because at the time, very, very small type with in lots of negative space was on trend. So like there was a lot of stuff in the world using like very, very fine type. That's not great, especially like in a mobile context when you're interacting with your hands. This is also before the accessibility tools in the OS were as good as they are now. So like users had to do a lot of stuff to be able to like see the view. We had a lot of color combinations that were problematic. I mean, there was a lot. So in the first brand review, accessibility was like, oh my God, this is going to be a nightmare. And we had to make that accessible. It was a relationship in the organization where like brand was first. Like my perception was like brand, like the relationship was marketing and brand, and then software design. Like we've got a brand, we love this brand, it tested really well, and it was really cool. Like it spoke to the audience, the market segment, very, very young, typically abled. So like what we did was a bunch of experiments in that brand, and a bunch of experiments that were more accessible to prove that we can work with this brand, but we've got to work with it in a different way to make it more usable. And then that was accepted. And that relationship, like that early, it was like 2 weeks, that relationship worked so well that we got a lot more like funding and support for the accessibility team to work through that. But at the same time, you know, like that, because it was a colorful brand, we ultimately had to make 177 or something color combinations accessible. So like, you'll see that, I think I remember like when Slack did a rebrand, they were like, oh, you don't even understand like how much money it actually costs to like manage multiple colors. It really does. We had 177 colors because we had like 6 approved. You got to think of their tints, their tones, their color combinations, like all this stuff. But we did it. And like that whole project got canned, the whole thing. Like we decided not to do this. But we took everything that we learned from that process and applied it to the parent brand, to the Verizon brand, to prevent that nightmare from ever occurring again. So what we're doing right now is we're doing our brand refresh. Same thing, Pentagram proposed a new, fresher red. That's like a brighter red because red is our color. And everyone was like, oh, that's great. Like that feels like literally more energetic because it vibrates higher. And as somebody who's photosensitive, like I was like, oh, you're going to give people a seizure if you do that. We can't use that color. We've got to use like a slightly different color that vibrates less hard, at least when we're talking about digital experiences. When we're talking about light, that's a different thing. And we were able to have that conversation pretty easily and pretty efficiently, like work through like decisions like that. So we're 5 years away from like where we started. Sorry, that was a really long-winded anecdotal answer.
But a very good one. Thank you. We also have coming in questions, so I'm going to read them to you. What would be your advice on leveraging accessibility in healthcare apps?
I mean, it's just like finance and anything else. Healthcare has its own challenges, as you know, from testing. Like you cannot test your patients. And it's really hard to like replicate a test case for a healthcare application, depending upon the type of healthcare application. It's insurance is a little different. But it's the same thing as any other space. When you're considering a user, especially if you know 100% the ability or the enablement of that user, that doesn't mean you can limit. Like if you know you've created a very small application that's for a user base that is like 18 to 20 and they have like celiac and like, you know, you get in healthcare, you can get very detailed very quickly. That doesn't mean you don't consider accessibility. Because there's all these temporal challenges too that you also have to consider that you won't be aware of. There's also like, you know, interrelated issues and unrelated issues. So you have to advocate for accessibility in any space like the same way you would, even if you know 100% who the user is for, unless you're making an application that has a user of one or like your like immediate friends and it's not for profit and it's your own thing you're making. Then maybe you don't have to consider accessibility, but like you're literally saying like, I don't care if people can't use this. And that would go with physical accessibility too. If you're making, and this happens a lot with any engineering-led organization, especially like in medical tools, they're like often like inside out. So like, you know, ergonomics means like putting a rubber handle on it or something, like same thing. Like you have to consider like how humans interact with it.
Okay.
That was like a non-helpful answer.
I'm sure they will re-ask something if it was not been answered accordingly. I got a question here from Anil asking, in addition to your design systems, what kind of tools have you developed in order to support accessibility testing, especially if there is an automatic accessibility testing tool? And then in addition to it, my question applies both testing and web pages and native mobile applications.
So I can only talk about our low fidelity testing. Like our accessibility team does the like production and pre-production environment testing. We use like services like DQ to help identify like missing labels and stuff like that. And then we just have like humans that review code and like review test experiences themselves. Those users are users of assistive technologies, testing them in a variety of assistive technologies that we support. We also, just like anything else, like have a ticketing system where we identify defects, especially in a big change in the OS. And so we still work through massive issues. One big challenge we have is our carousels, like carousels as a pattern. We use them a lot in design and they are all broken all the time and they're really hard to maintain. So as we're doing this big redesign, we're trying to like drastically change like how we do carousels for accessibility reasons and usability reasons. And then that like workflow sucks for the content producers. So the people that produce those content are like pissed that we're like requiring this big change. So at the same time, like, you know, we have to come at them and say like, yes, we're requiring this change, but we're also going to help you through like every single thing. So we're not just like giving somebody else the burden of this change. Back to low fidelity testing. So this is something that me and the test designer are going to try to like put together and publish in a shareable way, like a Medium or something. Sucks the Medium's also not super accessible, but she just came up with a method for doing some low fidelity prototyping. You can do like speak aloud and stuff like that. In the past, we've just had a lot of conversations where we've discussed how something might work and then showed some exemplary images and talked through like in their experience, what are like things where they have had problems and more of an avoidance thing rather than explicit testing. This is a very expensive method of testing because it's one-to-one in person. You can't like automate it. And we have not had good success to date doing any low fidelity web-based platform testing. Like we haven't had it. It's been like one-to-one video chat, record and synthesize.
Okay. And Amy asked, I'm a product manager working with third-party vendors who deliver software for us. Accessibility is kind on their radar, but it seems like they're not really sure where to start. We do have accessibility requirements in our contract, so I'd like to support them in taking the first steps, but without saying, do this, this is this, which I'm not even close to being qualified to do. Any tips?
Yeah, when it's code-based, when it's like how to write your code so that screen readers can interact with it, or so that browser controls like view controls can interact with it. There are a lot of experts in the world on this, like how to write your markup so that it can be interpreted better. And then they can go through and evaluate your code and coach like that. That to me, that's like a thing that has to happen. Someone has to come in and teach. There's not like an article you can read.
Okay. And how did you find test participants who have visual impairments, and how to make sure a user testing session is accessible and friendly to participants with visual impairments?
So this is the blocker that we have in low fidelity. When you use a web-based tool like usertesting.com or something, you can't, because they can't. You've got a flat image or you've got an envisioned prototype, but it's being shared through like a test platform. So there's no way the screen reader is going to like pick up that inception of like software and all the handshakes that are happening. That's why I'm saying it's the most expensive test that you have to run, because if you've got a coded prototype, you have to set up and conduct your own test session and have a way to give them access to that prototyping environment. So if it's web-based, maybe you can do that. If it's a native app, maybe you can do test flight. But even then, because it's running through test flight, you might have artificial defects because of the nature of test flight. So far, we've just experimented with read aloud, where we basically like role play, how a screen reader would pick it up and talk through that. You can also have, I mean, this is where we're lucky. We have an accessibility professional that works for us that's not sighted, who uses a screen reader and records it. And then our testing professionals can also just use screen readers of various types, record those and play them back for the design team, so we can hear what they experience and update our designs accordingly, or see where there are gaps. And you know, it is expensive, and it is a role, and there's not a great set of tools that address this.
The next question is very explicit. An accessibility workbook suggests a pale pastel lemon apricot for website background with a dark blue 10-point font. Does this fit with your thinking?
I mean, so this is where, like, to me, that's awesome. That's like where experiments, like, you have to draw lots and lots and lots of experiments. So if you have a design like that, and you're the reviewer, you can say it's definitely like you can have a category of things that are just wrong. Like, that's incorrect. Like, that doesn't meet contrast. But you can also, like, if ask the designer, if you're not the designer, to explore like higher contrast solutions, or explore using a different color combination without telling them change the blue. So those are the ways I would phrase it. Like, can we explore a different color combination? Is there a different color combination we can use? Is there a higher contrast color or a larger type size here? Is there a different CTA style? Like, those kinds of things, rather than like that blue is too blue or that blue is not blue enough.
The next question: when speaking about accessibility in my workplace, the conversation was most often about providing several options to interaction in the design. This spikes a problem of balancing simplicity but non-inclusivity, and overcomplicating but being inclusive. How do you work to balance having a software that is usable, inclusive, and also simple?
I mean, you don't balance it. Like, you over-index one way or the other all the time, and you constantly adjust. Like anybody, like everyone does this. This is like constant optimization. I mean, it's a push. So we constantly look for a way that the design can meet the needs of all users. What we can't do is say, like, here is the accessible version. Or, like, what you shouldn't do is be like, here's the design, but we tacked on this, like, little, what one of my leaders calls these trinkets, and I really like that. We can't, like, put trinkets everywhere for, like, because people can't find stuff. So it's like, oh, here's the page, but then here's like a bunch of garbage for people that couldn't find what they're looking for on the page. Like, that literally means your page is wrong. So you have to kind of find a way to be like, you know what, like, this isn't working. And I understand, like, in iterative software development, you might have to do that for a short period of time. You might have to be like, oh, wow, people couldn't find this and we're losing lots of money. Okay, put that there. But also you need another program to, like, overhaul the page design because it's not working. Or you have to come up with a pattern that works. Like, there are things that we know that are universally true, like users like buttony buttons. Visual designers like little tiny things that, like, keep the layout open. Where does your money come from? The visual designers or your end user? Where does your engagement come from? The designer or the end user? So you have to find a balance. Like, what's a nice looking buttony button that your user can use and that your designer and your brand team and whoever you answer to will accept.
Cool. We got a similar question here. Do you test your products with people who actually use screen readers due to having a visual loss? So testing directly with users instead of just your internal testers. If so, how did you go about recruiting these people and how do you work with them?
Yeah, so when we are able to test with end users using assisted technologies, we can screen them using a professional screening service. So that's an efficiency that we're able to afford. So we do that anyway. We ask them in the screener if they identify as a user that uses any of these services. And then we validate, like, if they actually have experience using one of those things. In our conversations with them, we will use testing platforms but it's more discussion based for that user because again, the same reasons I talked about before, like when you're using like user Zoom or usertesting.com or something like that, you're in a platform and then you're testing a platform within a platform. So the screen reader is not going to work. Post-COVID, hopefully we can get to a place where we have like in-person sessions again with them, and then we can plug them into our environments. We are not in a position where we can securely host our prototyping environments for those users. We can't do remote testing like at all as a capability. So that's a limitation that we have. But at other places, you're absolutely able to do that. You're able to like publish your prototype code base or give access and ask a user to do it, and then you can simulcast with them and they can talk through their experience or they can record their experience. So far, again, it's low fidelity. We have to ask them to imagine.
Cool. I think we're coming to the last question, which is actually for Nomensa. Will the recording be up somewhere? Yes, there will be on the YouTube channel, on the Nomensa YouTube channel, and they will be up and running in a couple of days after the session next week. And everybody who signed up will get an information via email. So if there are no other, I don't see any more questions coming in. I'm saying thank you, Brandy, for this fantastic session. Really enjoyed it. Yeah. Next session will be tomorrow at 10 a.m. UK time. Tomorrow's session will be about research and psychology and will be kicked off from Tania Ramos, US researcher at OutSystems, and we'll talk about behavioral science, a game changer for product development. If you haven't signed up yet, there's still time, do, and sign up via Eventbrite. Thank you very much. We've come to the end of this session. Thank you all for joining and see you all tomorrow. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks.